Palace aides rushed into the chamber. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Eyes turned to the monarch slumped in his chair. Then came the whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Catherine." And just like that, the room exploded into chaos. What had just been voted on? Why her name? This wasn't just a fainting spell. It was the unraveling of something monumental. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Moments before the collapse, the chamber had been locked in an eerie silence, pierced only by the rustle of papers and the murmurs of officials casting their votes on a proposal no one thought would actually make it to the floor. It had been drafted quietly, pushed forward swiftly, and debated behind heavy doors with only a select few even aware of its full implications. And then the moment arrived, a vote that would alter the structure of royal succession, with Catherine's name sitting quietly within the core of it. As the final vote was tallied, Charles reached for his water, his hand trembling slightly. The colour drained from his face, and before anyone could process what was happening, he dropped forward in his seat. Gasps echoed through the room. Aides surged forward. Security closed in. In the middle of the frenzy, one detail stood out, something so small it could have been lost in the panic, but wasn't. A whisper, a single name. Catherine. Not Camilla, not William, but Catherine. That whisper struck harder than the collapse itself. It was as if, in that last lucid moment, the king had surrendered to a truth he had been fighting to keep buried. In seconds, the royal emergency protocols were triggered. Phones were confiscated, staff were ordered out, and the chamber was locked down. Press were told it was a routine medical episode. But inside, no one believed that for a second. The whispers started almost instantly. Some claimed Charles had been warned about the vote and chose to attend anyway. Others said he hadn't known what exactly was being voted on until the moment the results were announced. And when he saw the numbers, saw how clearly his influence had been bypassed, it was too much. It wasn't just about policy, it was about power, legacy, trust, and the woman he had perhaps underestimated most, Catherine. One senior aide, later speaking off record, admitted he had seen Charles rehearsing a speech just days before, a speech no one ever got to hear. A speech, they believe, was meant to delay the vote or redirect its focus, but he never delivered it. Something stopped him. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps it was inevitability, or perhaps it was acceptance. Acceptance that the monarchy he thought he controlled had already begun slipping into new hands. And then came Camilla's reaction, not in front of the cameras, but behind a closed door she didn't realize was still mic'd. He knew this was coming, she snapped. He just didn't want to admit it. Her voice was sharp, her tone brittle. It wasn't worry that filled her voice, it was betrayal. The woman who had spent years crafting her place beside the throne was watching it crack beneath her feet. But to understand the weight behind that whispered name, we must turn back the clock back to the shadows that preceded this storm. She was meant to smile and wave, but behind palace curtains, Catherine wasn't just observing, she was strategizing. Slowly, methodically, she built alliances. When whispers began that she'd taken the Queen's private council meetings alone, few believed it. Now, they can't deny it. This isn't a duchess in waiting. This is a woman reshaping the monarchy itself. What began as graceful silence evolved into calculated command. Catherine had been underestimated by many, especially those who assumed her influence began and ended with public appearances. But within the palace walls, her presence grew steadily. She began attending internal briefings meant only for senior royals. Staff, who once aligned with Camilla's circle, quietly shifted toward Catherine's team. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence, but when senior advisors began reporting directly to her without being instructed to, the truth could no longer be denied. She was no longer the observer, she was the architect. Royal aides, bound by discretion, started referring to her in hushed tones as the quiet regent. Her questions in meetings weren't ceremonial, They were strategic, probing, and, at times, unsettling to those who saw her as merely ornamental. The late Queen Elizabeth, in her final year, had notably carved out several private sessions with Catherine moments that weren't listed on public schedules, and yet carried enormous significance. Insiders claimed the Queen admired Catherine's composure, her ability to read a room without speaking, and her near-unnerving calm under pressure. In one unrecorded meeting, the Queen allegedly handed her a sealed envelope labelled "Future Contingencies." That envelope, it is said, never left Catherine's personal study. Whatever its contents were, they set in motion a quiet shift that no one, not even Charles, was fully prepared for. But Catherine was not alone in this rise. Princess Anne, long seen as the most duty-bound member of the firm, had taken an interest in her early on, and while Anne never sought to steal attention, she knew how to build power behind the throne. With Anne's subtle guidance, Catherine learned not just the rules of monarchy, but how to bend them without ever breaking them. Together, they orchestrated a policy that restructured ceremonial roles, reducing the public-facing functions of Camilla's household and redistributing them across Catherine's network. It was worded with enough ambiguity to go unnoticed by the press, but the implications were seismic. From that point forward, Catherine wasn't simply stepping into her role, she was redefining it. The shift became visible when Camilla walked into a private meeting expecting to lead and found Catherine already seated at the head of the table. No words were exchanged, no scene was made. But the air turned ice cold. That was the moment. Camilla realized she was no longer the most powerful woman in the palace. The titles hadn't changed, but the hierarchy had. And it wasn't just about who sat where, it was about who everyone was now turning to for direction. The Queen Consort had the name, but Catherine had the loyalty, the strategy, and the legacy backing her. And while Catherine's ascent was quiet, deliberate, and rooted in legacy, the resistance against it was loud, bitter, and deeply personal. The walls of Windsor have absorbed centuries of secrets, but few as volatile as the feud between two queens. When Camilla found out about the dossier Catherine was preparing, insiders say she screamed, "She's trying to erase me." This wasn't gossip. This was a Cold War turning hot, and only one woman would walk away intact. Tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface finally began to erupt in full view of the inner circle. Catherine, with her calm precision, had begun organizing a series of reports outlining a new royal protocol, one that quietly diminished Camilla's ceremonial presence. The revelations came to light when a leaked document found its way into Camilla's private office. It wasn't addressed to her. It wasn't meant for her eyes. But there it was, in black and white proposed amendments to coronation procedures, stripping Camilla of several traditional honors and transferring them to Catherine's oversight. It read like a transfer of power cloaked in formality. Camilla's rage was immediate, and it wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. She accused Catherine of a quiet coup, and for the first time, royal aides heard the unmistakable sound of desperation in Camilla's voice. Behind the veil of palace protocol, Catherine had secured veto power over key public events. It was a position granted quietly, through a council vote led by Princess Anne and Prince Edward. When Camilla's team proposed a series of high-profile appearances for the Queen Consort, Catherine exercised her authority and shut it down. The explanation? Optics. But behind the scenes, it was about control. With each blocked appearance, Camilla's influence shrank further. Her frustration turned to fury. Staff described an atmosphere so tense. Aides were resigning in clusters, many citing ethical dissonance, and being forced to choose sides in a war that had gone far beyond tradition. King Charles, meanwhile, was collapsing under the emotional weight of this internal siege. He tried to play mediator, tried to preserve balance between the two women most central to his reign, but the effort only fractured his composure further. One evening at Balmoral, during what was meant to be a quiet family dinner, the dam finally broke. Camilla confronted Catherine in front of Charles, accusing her of stage-managing the monarchy like it was hers. Catherine didn't flinch. Her response was cold, deliberate. It was never yours to begin with. The silence that followed was more deafening than any outburst. Charles left the table without finishing his wine. The next morning, his closest advisor handed in his resignation. By the week's end, 3 more followed. The power struggle spilled into the corridors. Documents vanished. Schedules shifted. Private meetings were moved off-site to avoid surveillance. Every corner of the palace seemed soaked in suspicion. And while public appearances were still performed with practiced grace, insiders whispered that the institution was cracking from within. For Camilla, this was no longer about respect or visibility. It was about survival. For Catherine, it was never about erasure. It was about restoration, reclaiming the future of the monarchy and guiding it back onto a path she believed had been lost. Neither woman would back down. Neither believed she could afford to. But while the women clashed behind tapestries, it was the men closest to them who would set into motion a plan that would spark the ultimate breakdown. They told Prince William to wait. Timing is everything, one counsellor warned, but he ignored them. With Catherine at his side and Anne's backing, William issued a call that stunned the monarchy, a vote on emergency succession restructuring. The problem? No one warned King Charles, and what happened next would redefine everything. It began in secrecy, with an invitation-only meeting in a quiet corner of Sandringham. No advisors, no aides. Just William, Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and a few trusted insiders who had grown increasingly disillusioned with the direction of the crown. There was no grand speech, no dramatic declarations, only facts, strategy, and resolve. William laid out the proposal with the precision of a statesman, a restructuring of ceremonial succession duties that would officially pivot power away from Charles's court and toward the next generation. At the heart of it, a quiet clause, one that named Catherine not merely as Princess of Wales, but as Crown Executor-in-Waiting, a formal designation that would place her at the helm should the monarch be deemed temporarily unfit or incapacitated. The others agreed. It was time to move. As news of the pending vote leaked through discreet channels, panic rippled through Camilla's camp. Her allies called emergency meetings. Lobbying efforts intensified. Threats were whispered. Promises were made, but the clock had already moved too far forward. William had not only written the proposal, he had summoned a vote, invoking a rarely used clause that allowed for immediate internal decisions in matters deemed urgent to the Crown's public integrity. It was a masterstroke and a declaration of war. Then came the moment. With Charles away on private retreat, believing no major matters would be addressed in his absence, William entered the royal council chamber and presented the document. Every word of it had been calculated to pass legal scrutiny, every signature already lined up, and though Charles had not been consulted, the structure of the monarchy allowed the heir to act in cases of deemed vulnerability or crisis. The rationale? Ongoing instability and public confusion caused by competing royal narratives. Catherine's name, at the centre, was no accident. It was a signal. She wasn't waiting to be crowned, she was being prepared to lead. When Charles returned and was handed the proposal, his hands trembled. He read every word in silence, his expression growing darker with each line. Reports claim he asked one question: who authorized this? And when he was told the names William, Anne, Edward, he turned pale. "They've done this without me," he muttered. "They've rewritten the future." Those close to him said he appeared stunned, not by the content alone, but by the unity of those he once believed to be scattered in loyalty. He had always known William was growing restless, that Catherine was drawing influence, but he never expected the final blow to come from within. That night, Charles made no public statement, but in private, he summoned 3 of his closest advisors and dismissed them within minutes. He was unraveling not in rage, but in disbelief. He paced for hours, reportedly speaking to no one except his private secretary. At dawn, the palace medical staff noted signs of elevated stress and ordered him to rest. He refused, because for Charles, this wasn't politics. This was betrayal, stitched in royal silk. What followed wasn't just political fallout. It was a complete royal breakdown that would leave the monarchy's future hanging by a thread. He stood, raised his hand to speak, and then froze. Time stopped. Charles collapsed mid-sentence, just as the final vote tally was announced. Medical teams rushed in. Catherine was escorted out. Camilla was left standing in disbelief. But it was the whisper, his final word before blacking out, that sent shockwaves worldwide. The moment unfolded with the quiet intensity of a scene no one dared imagine. The final count had just been delivered overwhelming support for William's restructuring proposal. The entire chamber felt the shift. Charles, whose grip on power had already begun to loosen, stood to issue what many assumed would be a defiant royal address. But as he opened his mouth, his body betrayed him. His knees buckled. His eyes fluttered. Then came the collapse. Gasps erupted, chairs scraped against marble, and chaos descended. Senior members froze in stunned silence, while others surged forward. But amidst the shouting and the rush for medics, one detail would linger in the minds of everyone present: the king's voice, fragile and breathless, mouthing just one name: Catherine. Within seconds, the room transformed into a crisis zone. Royal security moved swiftly, establishing a perimeter. Medical staff worked frantically, and while no official cameras were allowed inside, whispers began spreading like wildfire. Staff who were inside the chamber didn't need to speak to the press. Word traveled anyway. He whispered Catherine's name. It was enough. In under an hour, the phrase had gone viral, splashed across headlines, echoed in breaking news segments across the globe. But for those inside the palace, this wasn't about press, it was about panic. The monarch had fallen, and the future had never been more uncertain. The royal family's reactions were a tapestry of fear, disbelief, and private reckoning. William, who had stood behind his father only moments earlier, was rushed out under security detail. His face, pale and unreadable. Anne remained still, eyes fixed on her brother, lips pressed into a tight line. Edward whispered something to an aide, then followed the medics out. Camilla, however, stood frozen motionless as if time itself had swallowed her. When she tried to follow Charles to his private recovery suite, she was reportedly stopped by security. "Not now, ma'am," was all they said. Behind closed doors, doctors confirmed what many feared: a sudden emotional and physical breakdown triggered by extreme stress. The strain of the vote, the betrayal he hadn't anticipated, the realization that the monarchy was no longer moving with him but beyond him. Charles had ignored the signs. He believed his reign still held authority, but that vote had spoken louder than any crown. Catherine, meanwhile, had been removed almost instantly from the scene. She was quietly ushered into a high-security wing within the palace, isolated from press, from speculation, even from her own family for several hours. Not for her safety, they said, but for protocol. Because now, her role was no longer symbolic. Now, the monarchy was circling around her, and whether she had asked for it or not, she was no longer simply a royal consort. She was a lightning rod, a name whispered at the edge of collapse. And while the public waited for updates on the king's condition, deep within palace corridors, a hidden document was about to change everything. Buried in the Queen's legacy files was a document Charles had amended in the days after her death, an unpublicized codicil. And on it, in ink and trembling script, he had named Catherine as the sovereign proxy in the event of incapacitation. No one was meant to find it. But now it was out, and its power undeniable. The vault in Clarence House was supposed to remain sealed, accessible only in moments of constitutional urgency. But following Charles's collapse, palace protocol demanded a full audit of succession documents. What they found wasn't just a will or a ceremonial outline, it was a codicil. Dated weeks after Queen Elizabeth's funeral, its language was unmistakable. In the event of the monarch's physical or mental incapacitation, executive authority would pass to the designated sovereign proxy. And that proxy, chosen not through Parliament but by Charles himself, was Catherine. The paper bore the royal seal. It had been countersigned by 2 late advisors and annotated by Charles in his own hand, but it had never been disclosed. Not to Camilla, not to the Privy Council, and certainly not to the press. The legal implications were explosive. As sovereign proxy, Catherine would have the authority to oversee state functions, meet with foreign dignitaries, and even review royal decrees. Though not a queen in title, she would hold the full ceremonial weight of the crown without ever being crowned. It was a quiet transfer of power, designed to preserve continuity should crisis ever strike. But it also served another purpose. It removed Camilla from the equation entirely. Her name appeared nowhere. No clause for regency, no fallback authority, just silence. And in a family where silence speaks volumes, that silence roared. As lawyers scrambled to interpret the codicil's reach, palace corridors buzzed with conflicting theories. Could this document override public declarations? Did it require parliamentary ratification? And why had Charles kept it hidden? Those closest to the king knew the answer. He had doubted his own resilience. In the weeks after his mother's passing, Charles had been gripped by grief and uncertainty. He feared not just for the crown, but for his ability to bear it. And in that vulnerable state, he made a decision that bypassed politics and looked toward legacy. He chose stability. He chose strength. He chose Catherine. Princess Anne, ever the guardian of protocol, was one of the few who validated the document's authenticity. She remembered the private discussion with Charles. She had witnessed his signature, and when asked if she believed it still reflected the king's intent, her answer was swift. It reflects what he knew would be necessary. That confirmation ended all speculation. The codicil stood, and with it, Catherine's role was cemented, undeniable, irrevocable, and legal. Camilla's reaction was swift and scathing. Sources say she locked herself in her private quarters for hours, emerging only to deliver a furious message to Charles's private secretary. "This is a betrayal of everything I was promised." Her voice, hoarse with disbelief, echoed through the marble halls. She had fought for her place, fought to be seen. And now, with one buried signature, it had been stripped away not by accident, but by choice, by Charles's hand, by his will. But while documents and legalities stirred behind the scenes, one man broken and recovering was finally ready to speak. He motioned for everyone to leave. Alone with his son and sister, King Charles reportedly broke down in tears. "I was never strong enough," he admitted. "She was always meant to lead." He wasn't speaking of Camilla. And in those quiet, broken words, the monarchy's future shifted toward a new destiny. The hospital room, once filled with advisors, doctors, and staff, grew silent as Charles insisted only William and Anne remain. The door closed, and with it, the weight of protocol fell away. There were no crowns here, no titles, just a father, a brother, and a man, shattered by the realization that he had lost control of the world he was born to command. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, with a voice cracked not just from illness but from decades of burden, Charles opened up. He confessed he had known for some time that the crown was slipping not because of age, but because of fear. Fear that his reign would be marked by hesitation, that history would remember him as a man who preserved nothing and challenged no one. He said Catherine had never once asked for power, but she never flinched from it either. And that, he said, was why she must lead. William, seated beside him, was visibly shaken. His father's words, raw and stripped of pride, carried more weight than any decree. Anne, stoic as always, simply listened, her eyes fixed on her brother, offering silent solidarity. Then Charles did something few expected. He brought up Camilla not in anger, but in sorrow. He admitted he'd tried to balance love and legacy, but in doing so had created two thrones in a kingdom built for one. "She deserved kindness," he said softly, "but I gave her a crown she was never meant to wear." His voice broke, and he turned to William. "She'll hate me for this." Then, the words that would stay with William forever: "Tell her I'm sorry." There was no arrogance in that apology, no royal detachment. Just a man acknowledging that he had led too long with his heart and too little with his instinct, that he had ignored the signs, that he had placed trust where there was loyalty but not strength. Catherine, he admitted, had held the crown even before it was offered. She had earned it in silence, in grace, in her ability to lead without needing to be seen. And now, it was time to accept what had always been true. William, eyes brimming with emotion, leaned in and replied with quiet conviction, "She already knows, Father." The words weren't just a comfort, they were a confirmation. The torch had been passed not through ceremony or public decree, but through an intimate reckoning, a father handing the future to the woman his monarchy needed, even if it meant undoing promises made in another life. But outside that room, the public waited, and the press began to dig into the truth behind the king's whisper and the royal reshuffle. No public declaration, no ceremony, and yet everything had changed. Catherine's presence now commanded the throne room. Meetings were rescheduled, duties reassigned, and whispers of "Queen in everything but name" grew louder. This was a soft coronation of influence. And for those still loyal to Camilla, it was a nightmare they couldn't stop. Within days of Charles's collapse, the center of royal authority had shifted quietly but unmistakably. While official titles remained untouched, the machinery of monarchy moved under Catherine's command. She chaired her first internal strategy session with senior aides, not as a substitute, but as the expected authority. Her instructions were executed without question. Royal correspondence began arriving with her name listed before others. Her calendar, once managed through Charles's household, was now dictated by her own team. She was no longer orbiting power. She had become its axis. It wasn't long before she held her first solo audience with Commonwealth ambassadors. Not a photo op, not a ceremonial handshake, a full diplomatic engagement. The message was clear: continuity through Catherine. And the world took notice. Foreign dignitaries remarked on her composure, her clarity, her command of history and protocol. Meanwhile, Camilla, once ever present, vanished from the public eye. No scheduled appearances, no press briefings, no palace luncheons. It was a silence so loud, even her supporters felt its sting. Behind closed doors, aides whispered of her refusal to attend any event where Catherine presided. Others claimed she demanded private meetings with Charles, each one denied. And then came the headlines. The true queen in waiting. Catherine takes control. Public sentiment, already leaning in her favor, exploded. Polls showed overwhelming support for her leadership. Social media flooded with comparisons between her restraint and Camilla's absence. The public didn't just accept the shift, they embraced it. The face of the monarchy had changed, and it wore a quiet crown. Inside Buckingham Palace, the transformation was even more direct. Senior royals Edward, Anne, even Charles's most trusted advisors began realigning loyalties. Not in betrayal, but in recognition of reality. Every conversation, every meeting, every policy draft now flowed through Catherine's circle. And then came the internal memo, quietly circulated among staff, unsigned but unmistakably sanctioned. It referred to Catherine not as Princess of Wales, not even as Queen in Waiting, but as acting monarch. Two words that changed everything. Not a title of ambition, a title of necessity, of inevitability. And through it all, Catherine never made a statement, never claimed authority. She simply stepped into the role and never looked back. The monarchy, bruised and uncertain, found its footing in her steadiness. And as she moved through the palace, dignified and composed, there was no doubt left among those who once questioned her. She wasn't replacing anyone. She was fulfilling something long written between the lines. Yet, even as Catherine steps into her destiny, there's one final moment that cements her future, and Charles's whispered name will echo forever because of it. In a sealed statement released post-recovery, King Charles addressed the nation. His voice, aged by pain and clarity, declared, "Catherine has my trust, my blessing, and my crown when the time comes." The monarchy stood at a threshold. One chapter closing, another beginning with a woman once whispered about, now reigning in full view. The statement, pre-recorded from his private quarters, was released without fanfare, no ceremony, no live press conference. But it didn't need spectacle. Every word struck with quiet finality. Charles looked into the lens not as a king holding on, but as a man letting go. He spoke of duty, of burden, and of watching the tides of history shift. And then, without hesitation, he uttered the words that confirmed what the nation had already begun to feel. It is Catherine who must guide the next chapter. It was an endorsement, yes, but more than that. It was absolution. From the monarch who once clung to tradition, now came a benediction for transformation. The public reaction was immediate and emotional. For many, it was the closure they didn't realize they needed. After months of uncertainty, conflict, and whispered power plays, the message brought clarity. It wasn't just about who would wear the crown, it was about who had earned it. Streets filled with supporters holding signs not of protest, but of celebration. Media outlets around the world replayed the statement on a loop. Commentators who once questioned Catherine's preparedness now spoke of her as destiny fulfilled. Camilla remained silent. Her absence from public view extended even after the address. No statement, no appearance, not even a prepared quote from her office. Behind that silence, speculation raged. Some said it was a quiet exit. Others believed it was the beginning of a deeper resentment. But the truth, perhaps, was more painful. In the echo of Charles's words, she heard the undoing of everything she'd fought to build. A reign she believed she'd earned, slipping away with a single name. And then came the photo. Released just days later, it showed William and Catherine standing shoulder to shoulder, regal yet grounded. There was no caption. None was needed. It was the monarchy's future, captured in a frame. And behind them, in spirit, if not presence, stood the man who had finally understood what leadership truly meant, not holding power, but passing it with purpose. For Charles, it was not merely retirement, it was resolution. His reign, forged in shadows and struggle, ended not with triumph, but with truth. He had faltered, he had fought, but in the end, he found clarity. And in Catherine, he found his legacy not through bloodline alone, but through belief. The woman he whispered for in collapse now stood as the one who would carry his crown forward. In the end, it wasn't a royal edict or parliamentary decree that changed history, it was a whisper, and the world would never forget it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.